The Age of Kings. The growth of royal power. Wars of religion. During the Reformation, most kings took control of religion within their own borders. For example, in England, Henry VIII made himself the head of the national church as early as 1534. The religious wars that followed the Reformation provided kings with an opportunity to build large standing armies, to introduce new government officials, known as bureaucrats, and to increase taxes. The army was used to put down any resistance to higher taxes. Changing roles of the nobility. In the Middle Ages, nobles had been an independent source of power. Many even had their own castles and armies. In the 1600s, rulers like Louis XIV tamed the nobility. Louis built a magnificent palace at Versailles, where the nobility were forced to live by his side under his watchful eye. Nobles kept their wealth and privileges, but were expected to obey the king's commands. The growth of the middle class in towns frequently allied themselves with kings against any resistance by the nobility. New justifications for royal power. New theories arose to justify royal authority. Many rulers adopted the Renaissance view, justifying their actions on the basis of reason of state. An Englishman, Thomas Hobbes, wrote that man was not naturally good. Without a strong central authority to keep order, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Society would break down into a, quote, war of every man against every man, quote. Hobbes said kings were justified in seizing absolute power because only they could act impartially to maintain order in society. Other monarchs, like James I in England and Louis XIV in France, justified their power on the basis of divine right. According to this theory, a king was God's deputy on earth, and royal commands expressed God's wishes. Absolutism refers to a monarch's total control over his subjects. Louis XIV of France provided a model for other absolute monarchs. His will was law. Any critic who challenged the king was punished. Louis interfered in the economic and religious lives of his subjects. His regulations established standards for all French industries. He demanded that Protestants convert to Catholicism or leave France. Leading nobles were forced to spend most of the year residing with the king at Versailles, so they had no opportunity to disobey or rebel. Louis developed a large army with standardized uniforms, training, and housing. He involved his nation in a series of wars to expand France's frontiers and bring glory to his rule. Although he probably never said, "I am the state," this expression accurately summarized his view of royal power. In the end, Louis's aggressive actions served to unite Europe against France, leaving his country bankrupt at his death. Peter the Great reigned 1682 to 1725. Peter turned Russia from a backward nation into a modern power by introducing Western ideas, culture, and technology. He went on a voyage to the West, working in shipyards in Holland and visiting England. In Russia, he executed his mutinous palace guard and developed a new army on Western lines. He used force to make the old Russian nobles shave their beards and wear Western-style clothing instead of traditional Russian garb. He defeated neighboring Sweden and Turkey, greatly extending Russia's boundaries. He took control of the church, imported foreign workers, and opened new schools. Peter moved the capital of Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg, a modern city he built on the Baltic coast so that Russia would have a, quote, window on the West. Catherine the Great reigned 1762 to 1796. 40 years after Peter's death, Catherine II continued Peter's policies of expansion and westernization. She also promoted limited reform at the beginning of her reign, corresponding with leading French thinkers, and even granted nobles their own charter of rights. However, she refused to part with any of her absolute power. During her reign, the conditions of the Russian serfs actually worsened. She defeated the Ottoman Empire, expanded Russia's border to the Black Sea, and carved up Poland with her neighbors. Limited monarchy. In England, monarchs were never able to establish absolute rule as their fellow monarchs did in France and Russia. Already in the Middle Ages, strong checks had been established on the English king's power. The Magna Carta. In 1215, English nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which guaranteed that Englishmen could not be fined or imprisoned except according to the laws of the land. John also agreed not to raise new taxes without the consent of his barons. The Magna Carta demonstrated that the king's power could be limited. The rise of Parliament. Parliament was established as a legislative body made up of nobles in the House of Lords and elected representatives in the House of Commons. New taxes needed the approval of Parliament. England's road to limited monarchy. Later events turned England into a limited monarchy, in which subjects enjoyed basic rights and power was shared between the king and the Parliament. Tudor monarchs. In the 16th century, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I created a strong, centralized monarchy based on a sense of national unity, the Church of England, and a sharing of power between the monarch and Parliament. Henry relied on Parliament to approve his break with the Catholic Church in Rome. Early Stuart monarchs. James I became king in 1603. James believed in the divine right of kings and often came into conflict with Parliament. His son, Charles I, tried to establish absolutism and to collect new taxes without Parliament's consent. He imprisoned those who refused to obey. When the House of Commons questioned these practices, Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled without it for 11 years. A rebellion in Scotland forced Charles to recall Parliament. He needed their help in 1640 to pursue his policies in Scotland, but they continued to disagree. English Civil War, 1642 to 1649. The conflict soon led to a civil war between the king and Parliament. Army reforms were introduced by Parliament that helped it to win the Civil War. In 1649, Charles was tried and became the first English monarch to be executed. The Glorious Revolution, 1688 to 1689. A second English Revolution occurred when James II converted to Catholicism and failed to respect many of his subjects' rights. Angered by his actions, Parliament deposed James II and invited James's daughter and her husband to take his place. In 1689, William and Mary, the new rulers, agreed to the Bill of Rights, establishing Parliament's supremacy over the king and other rights. William and Mary agreed that they would neither collect new taxes nor raise any army without obtaining Parliament's consent. These events marked a final shift of power from the monarch to Parliament, and Parliament was never again successfully challenged.